Today it is the Global Symposium on Soil Organic Carbon,
Yes.
here at the headquarters of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations in Rome, Italy. So you're here today to present a poster that is here in the background, Regenerative Development to Reverse Climate Change. What are we looking at here?
Well, okay. Briefly, the key question here is how quickly CO2 in the atmosphere can be stabilized at levels that are safe in terms of global warming and global sea level rise. And how quickly can that be done? The first question we have to answer is, what is the safe level of CO2? The fact is, the safe level of CO2 is 260 parts per million. We're now at 400. 260 is the pre-industrial level of CO2. The last time global CO2 was 270 parts per million, global temperatures were about 1 to 2 degrees warmer than today. Sea levels were 7 meters higher, and London, England had crocodiles and hippopotamuses. That was 120,000 years ago, and that was for 270 parts per million. Now, if we want to keep sea level where it is now and avoid flooding flooding London, England under seawater, for example, in almost all the big cities of the world, we have to reduce CO2 to safe levels. Now, IPCC unfortunately made serious errors in their climate sensitivity because they've based their predictions on models, not on the long-term climate data. So what I use a long-term, a million years almost, of Antarctic ice core records of CO2 temperature and sea level, with fossil corals and deep sea sediments, and then we can actually figure out, how sensitive temperature and sea level are to CO2. Now, for today's CO2, the equilibrium temperature is about 17 degrees C warmer than today for today's CO2, and the equilibrium sea level is about 23 meters above today's level. People don't understand that, and the thing is that when we increase CO2 suddenly, climate doesn't respond right away. It takes thousands of years to respond because that heat, almost all of it goes down to the deep sea. And until the deep sea warms up, we won't feel the effect of the surf. So there's thousands of years of time lag built into the system, and IPCC does not include that. They only look at the beginning of the transient response and not at the full response, so they miss 90% of the effects in their predictions. So it's much more serious than people realize.
So the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change?
Yes, that's correct. And the thing is, IPCC had a political mandate to use models to calculate what climate change impacts were expected over 10, 20, or 100 years. And the point is that it takes thousands of years, so they're missing most of the response. Their mandate was a political mandate, not a scientific one. Now, our mission really is to save climate for the future, and so we've got to be scientifically sound. So that's why the scientifically sound CO2 is 260 ppm, not 350, not 400 or anything else. So now our question is, how quickly can we get to that level? By increasing soil carbon. And now we've already lost most of the coral reefs to global warming. We're going to lose most of the rest this year. So we need to act very quickly. And soil is the only place we can store that carbon in time to avoid the difference. So in this case here, let's consider how quickly we can reduce CO2 to safe levels as a function of the rate of increased carbon drawdown into soil and as a function of how long it lasts in the soil. So with today's agricultural practices, these are carbon incorporation into soil in tons of carbon per hectare per year. And conventional agriculture is only putting about 1 or 2 tons of carbon into soil per hectare per year. With advanced carbon farming, especially using tree forestry and mixed species assemblers, you can get very much more carbon into the ground. And these are techniques that people have worked out. They're not being applied on a large scale. Most farmers are down here. But if we can increase at the present levels here, we're putting in very little carbon into the ground on the average, and 99% of it decomposes. It's not long-lived soil carbon. So in fact, most of that carbon is simply going back into the atmosphere with a time delay. So at the present time, it would take thousands of years to draw down CO2 to safe levels, and we'll suffer the runaway effects of climate change. If we want to draw it down quickly, well, if we are to increase the drawdown rate worldwide on the land surface to say 10 tons per carbon per year, which is achievable with present methods, we reduce the time to stabilize CO2 from thousands of years to hundreds of years. If now we can increase the percentage of long-lived carbon from 1% to 10%, then we can do the job in decades. So the only way to do it in time is to both increase the quantity and quality. So you have to maximize both of them. And of course, the longer we take to do it, the more difficult it will become. So this says it's possible to do if we use what we know now and do it quickly. It's quite a feasible task. So we want to ask now, where can we most effectively draw the carbon down? And the problem is that there are a lot of people who are mulching the ground with compost, and it all rots and decomposes, a lot of it. So the two critical leverage points for increasing soil carbon storage quickly is to use what's called biochar. It's like an advanced form of charcoal, but it's made at higher temperature, and you have to mature it. It's like a charcoal to which you've added rock powder and you add compost. And the reason you do that is carbon is not a fertilizer. You have to add the missing nutrients the plants need, and the rock powder provides all the elements the plants need except for nitrogen. That you have to provide with compost. And then you add beneficial bacteria. But with that, what's called biochar, if you add it to soil and add mature biochar, and this shows percent biochar in the soil versus the height of seedlings that are grown, you can see that without any biochar, they're about 20, this height, 2 centimeters high, 20 millimeters. But with increasing good biochar, mature biochar, you can see the growth rate doubles up here. But if you use the raw biochar, the carbon that hasn't had the other elements and nitrogen and other stuff added, it actually suppresses plant growth. See, it cuts it down. It actually kills the plants. Now, the problem is that half the people using biochar are using raw biochar, and they're getting negative results. The other half are using the good stuff. And the thing about biochar is there's a lot of controversy over how long it lasts. And the reason there's controversy, a lot of people are using low-quality biochar that has full of volatile materials, can decompose easily. But if you use the good quality stuff, it lasts millions of years in the soil. I mean, I've looked at fossil charcoal that's 65 million years old. It's perfectly preserved. There's 350 million year old charcoal. In the sediments, we've known as geochemists that that's an essentially indestructible tracer. So it really does last. So biochar can be applied in any soil.
How do you make good biochar?
Well, what you've got to do is you can make it from any form of carbon, but of course the quality depends on what you do, whether wood or straw or manure, anything that has carbon in it. Of course, there's different ratios of nitrogen and other elements in it, and by and large, when you lose a lot of the nitrogen when you volatilize, so you've got to add that back in, and often the ash or the charcoal you make is deficient in other elements like magnesium, calcium, potassium that plants need that rock can provide. So if you add what's there, the biochar binds it all. It holds on to those nutrients. It holds on to water very effectively, so it increases the growing season, and it provides an ideal medium for the symbiotic fungi that grow in plant roots. Those grow right into the biochar. They suck up the nutrients and give it right to the roots and into the plant without it passing through the soil at all. So it's a very efficient way of increasing plant growth. And it can be applied in any soil. So we want to see a lot more biochar. That's one of the two critical leverage points. The other one is marine wetlands. Now, there's nearly 5 times more carbon in soil than there is in the atmosphere or the biosphere. People don't often forget that. And half of the carbon in soils in the world is in wetland soils, swamps and bogs, because things don't compose easily in those areas. There's not enough oxygen. And half of the wetland soils in what we call marine wetlands. These are salty soils, mangroves, seagrasses, and salt marshes. They only occupy 1% of the Earth's surface or so. But they have a quarter of all the soil carbon and more carbon than the atmosphere. So, and they're the richest carbon of all soils. I mean, they produce peat that can be almost pure organic material. So they're very effective carbon sinks. And the point is that...
Can you just show us where mangroves grow around?
Mangroves, salt marshes, and seagrass. Yeah. And the thing is that if we restore those, we're destroying them very fast, those ecosystems. But if we restore them, it's the most effective way of storing carbon in large amounts in a small area for the least cost. Now, we've developed methods for doing that using electricity. I'm the inventor of a method that we restore coral reefs and marine ecosystems using electricity. It works for salt marsh, seagrass, and mangroves. And so we're beginning to develop those, and it also will increase the carbon storage. So we think we have new experimental methods that will greatly increase that kind of carbon sequestration. We're developing them now in Indonesia, and we plan to continue. Now, there's a very important political development because, as you know, in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, governments have resisted any form of honest carbon accounting. So we have very incomplete accounting. The original draft of UNFCCC had complete carbon accounting. I know that because I put it in personally. I was a senior scientific affairs officer for global climate change and biodiversity at the United Nations Center for Science and Technology for Development when the first draft was being written. I put all that stuff into it. Governments eliminated it because they didn't want to have to account for any carbon except for fossil fuel emissions. So we have incomplete accounting of greenhouse gas sources and sinks, and without complete accounting of the carbon and the other methane and nitrous oxide, we can't possibly balance it. So we have dishonest and incomplete accounting, and sooner or later, basically, we are going to have a mechanism by which those people who put CO2 into the atmosphere are paying the people who are putting it back into the ground where it came from. We want to take that CO2, put it back into the ground, and we have the methods to do so. Have been developed. The existing state of the art allows that to be done, but we're not using what we know on an adequate scale. People have invented methods for restoring their own ecosystems everywhere in the world with astonishing success, but it's only a few people doing it right now because it's not government policy to promote carbon farming. Because the countries that are living off fossil fuel production and consumption don't want any change in business as usual, so they've been opposed to any form of honest carbon trading. Now, it happens that we have a new hope for progress in climate change. It comes from the Commonwealth Secretariat. The Commonwealth Secretariat is 52 countries with 2.5 billion people. It's 1/3 of the Earth's population. The Secretary General of the Commonwealth, Lady Patricia Scotland, is promoting the regenerative development to reverse climate change strategy for the next UNFCCC. That hasn't yet been formally announced. We had a planning meeting in London late last year. It's going to be developed at the next Commonwealth Secretariat meeting, which I believe is in June in Singapore. And then the Commonwealth plans to present serious initiatives regarding regenerative development to reverse climate change at the next UNFCCC. Now, we know that those countries that live off fossil fuel production, like the United States, Russia, and the OPEC countries, are going to resist that. The point is that we can't wait for them to understand what needs to be done. We have to start doing the right thing in taking that CO2 out and taking it away from the atmosphere. It's doing the most possible harm and putting it back into the ground where we'll do the most possible good, increasing soil fertility, preserving our soil, increasing our water resources, keeping the stuff that's killing the sea out of the ocean. So there are enormous benefits for doing that every single country would benefit from having more carbon in their soil. Their forests, their agriculture would be more productive, they'd have better water supplies, and their temperature would be cooler. Make a very big difference because, in fact, the evapotranspiration of the plants is what has a huge cooling effect. So once you restore the carbon and the vegetation, you cool the soil down.